Imagine a prospector sitting at a table with 50 pounds of pure gold, enough to live like a king for 3 lifetimes. But he isn't celebrating. He's dead. Yet, the starving wolves and vultures haven't touched a single inch of his flesh. Why? Because while he was hunting for wealth, he was slowly turning his own body into a toxic statue. His teeth fell out, his old childhood scars ripped open, and his brain melted into madness, all because of the invisible killer he carried in his own saddlebag. In the middle of October of the year 1850, a weary physician was summoned from the growing chaos of Sacramento to an isolated claim located high along the banks of the American River. He arrived expecting to treat a common case of fever or a broken limb, but what he found was a medical anomaly that defied the understanding of every standard textbook available in the civilized world. The journey itself had been a descent into the primitive, but the destination was a canvas tent that seemed to exhale a miasma of decay, a structure saturated with the pungent, suffocating odors of black mold, unwashed bodies, and human filth that had been festering under the relentless California sun for months without respite. Inside this gloomy shelter, the doctor encountered a young man who looked more like a specter than a human being, a figure whose physical form was rapidly betraying him in the most grotesque manner imaginable. The prospector was seated on a rough crate, attempting the simple, everyday task of holding a tin cup filled with water, but his body was in open rebellion against his will. His limbs were seized by a tremor so violent and rhythmic that it looked as though he were being electrocuted by an invisible current, causing the water to splash uncontrollably over his knuckles and onto the packed earth floor, turning the dust into a dark, muddy slurry at his feet. As the physician stepped closer to examine the patient, he witnessed a horrifying deterioration of the mouth that went far beyond the ravages of poor hygiene or simple malnutrition. The young man's gums had receded and were stained a shocking, unnatural shade of blue-black, a dark necrosis that framed teeth so loose they rattled and shifted with the slightest touch of his swollen tongue. A continuous, viscous stream of saliva dripped from the corners of his mouth, a flow he was utterly unable to check or control, dripping down his chin and staining his shirt, signaling a total collapse of his autonomic nervous system and a body that was literally rotting from the inside out. However, the physical ruin of the man was secondary to the absolute terror that inhabited his gaze, a psychological fracture that was far more disturbing than his trembling hands. His eyes darted frantically from the canvas walls to the shadows in the corners, widened with a primal, animalistic panic as if he were surrounded by invisible demons that only he could perceive in the dim light. There was no recognition of safety in his expression, only the wild, hunted look of a creature cornered by predators, his mind having retreated into a labyrinth of paranoia and hallucinations where reality had been replaced by a waking nightmare. When the doctor attempted to speak, offering words of comfort or asking for a symptom history, the reaction was not one of relief, but of aggressive, defensive instinct. The prospector did not answer. Instead, he recoiled violently, letting out a low, guttural growl like a wounded wolf, and scrambled backward, attempting to bury himself beneath a pile of filthy, lice-ridden blankets. He clawed at the fabric, pulling it over his head in a desperate bid to hide from the medical help he so clearly needed, viewing the physician not as a savior, but as another demon sent to torment him in his delirium. To the trained eye of the doctor, this tableau of suffering did not fit the clinical profile of the scourges that were currently ravaging the camps, bearing no resemblance to the swift dehydration of cholera or the burning fevers of typhus. This was a slow, agonizing disintegration of the central nervous system, a portrait of a human being whose body and mind were being systematically disassembled by an unknown agent. It was the face of a man who had been poisoned not by a virus, but by the very dream he had traveled thousands of miles to chase, a victim of a toxic madness that was silently claiming the miners of the gold rush one by one. The Great Deception began with a collective delirium that swept across the civilized world in the year 1849, a psychological contagion far more virulent than any biological disease. From the rocky farms of New England to the bustling workshops of London, tens of thousands of men abandoned their plows, their ledgers, and their families, seduced by a singular, intoxicating myth propagated by sensationalist newspaper headlines. The press painted a picture of California not as a wild frontier, but as a literal El Dorado where gold nuggets the size of walnuts lay scattered across the ground, waiting to be gathered by anyone with a sack and a functioning pair of hands. This narrative of effortless wealth bypassed rationality and struck directly at the heart of human greed, convincing clerks and teachers that they were but a few months of travel away from retiring as kings in a land of eternal summer. However, the moment these hopeful pilgrims arrived in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the golden haze of their imagination was violently stripped away by the brutal topography of the land. Instead of a paradise of easy riches, they stepped into a landscape that was hostile to human life, a rugged terrain of sharp granite and dense scrub oak that demanded backbreaking labor for every ounce of sustenance it yielded. The romantic image of the leisurely prospector vanished instantly, replaced by the grim reality of the miner as a beast of burden, a man forced to move mountains of earth one shovel at a time. They discovered that the gold was not lying on the surface, but was hidden deep within the geological strata, locked inside tons of gravel and clay that had to be excavated, hauled, and processed with primitive tools that blistered the hands and broke the back. The primary instrument of their torture was the very element they needed to find the gold, the water of the mountain streams, which flowed directly from the melting snowpack of the high peaks. To extract the precious metal, the men had to stand knee-deep or waist-deep in the rushing currents for 10 to 12 hours a day, their legs submerged in liquid that was barely above freezing temperatures. This constant immersion leached the heat from their bodies, turning their skin a pale, corpse-like gray and causing a perpetual numbness that masked the damage being done to their tissues. The cold gnawed at their joints, sowing the seeds of crippling rheumatism that would plague them for the rest of their short lives, while the constant friction of wet sand and rocks ground the skin off their feet, leaving raw, weeping sores that refused to heal in the damp environment. Compounding the misery of the freezing water was the omnipresent, suffocating mud that came to define the existence of the 49er. During the rainy season, the mining camps dissolved into a chaotic quagmire of sticky, brown sludge that coated everything it touched, invading boots, bedding, and food supplies with a relentless persistence. There was no escaping it. The men slept in damp blankets that smelled of wet wool and mildew, woke up to put on clothes that were stiff with dried clay, and walked through a landscape where the earth threatened to suck the boots right off their feet. This perpetual dampness created a breeding ground for fungus and rot, ensuring that the miners were never dry, never warm, and never clean, their bodies constantly fighting a losing battle against the encroaching filth of their own workspace. The camps themselves were hastily constructed shantytowns that sprang up overnight without any thought given to urban planning or basic infrastructure. Tents made of thin canvas and shacks cobbled together from scrap lumber and brush were packed tightly together in narrow valleys, creating a density of population that rivaled the slums of New York or London. In these primitive settlements, there were no sewers, no garbage collection, and no designated areas for human waste, turning the pristine wilderness into a festering open-air cesspool within a matter of weeks. The stench of the camps was legendary, a thick, palpable miasma of rotting food scraps, animal carcasses, and human excrement that hung in the stagnant air of the canyons, assaulting the senses and signaling the total collapse of sanitary discipline. In such squalid conditions, where men drank from the same streams they used for washing and waste disposal, the biological consequences were immediate and devastating. The most feared killer in the camps was not the grizzly bear or the rattlesnake, but the microscopic bacterium responsible for dysentery, a horrific affliction known in the vernacular of the time as the bloody flux. It moved through the population with the speed of a wildfire, striking down strong young men who had survived the perilous journey across the plains only to wither away in their own filth. The disease stripped a man of his dignity before it took his life, reducing him to a shivering, dehydrated skeleton racked by uncontrollable spasms of pain and the incessant, humiliating evacuation of his bowels. The medical reality of the gold fields was a nightmare of helplessness, as there were few doctors and even fewer medicines available to treat the spreading epidemics. A man stricken with the flux was often isolated in a hospital tent that was nothing more than a canvas morgue, where he lay on the damp ground waiting for the end or for a miraculous recovery that rarely came. The screams and groans of the dying became the background noise of the camp at night, a grim counterpoint to the silence of the wilderness, serving as a terrifying reminder of the fragility of life. Those who survived were often left too weak to work, their strength drained by the illness, forcing them to watch helplessly as their claims were jumped or their meager savings evaporated in the struggle to buy another day of life. Survival in the camps was further jeopardized by a nutritional catastrophe, as the diet of the average miner was almost entirely devoid of the essential vitamins required to sustain human health. Fresh vegetables and fruits were practically non-existent in the remote mining districts, their transport over the mountains being too difficult and expensive for most merchants to bother with. Instead, the men subsisted on a monotonous, gray diet of salt pork, beans, and hardtack, a rock-hard cracker that was often infested with weevils and maggots. To make the biscuits edible, miners would have to soak them in coffee and skim the floating larvae off the surface, a ritual of disgust that became a mundane part of their daily routine. This lack of nutrition weakened their immune systems, making them even more susceptible to the diseases that ravaged the camps, creating a vicious cycle of malnutrition and sickness. The economic reality of the gold rush was a cruel inversion of the dream, where the cost of living rose faster than the gold could be pulled from the ground. The laws of supply and demand operated with a savage efficiency in the isolated camps, creating a hyperinflationary economy where a single egg could cost as much as a week's wages in the East. Merchants and opportunists, realizing that the true wealth lay in mining the miners, charged extortionate prices for the most basic necessities of life. A pair of boots, a shovel, or a sack of flour commanded prices that stripped the prospectors of their hard-won dust, transferring the wealth from the laborers in the river to the shopkeepers in the canvas tents. Many men found that after months of backbreaking labor, they were poorer than when they arrived, their pouches empty and their debts mounting. This economic trap transformed the psychology of the 49ers, curdling their initial optimism into a bitter, cynical desperation. The camaraderie of the trail, where men helped one another across the deserts and mountains, evaporated in the competitive pressure of the gold fields. Every neighbor became a potential rival, every new arrival a threat to the dwindling resources of the claim. The fear of failure, of returning home to their families in rags and shame, drove them to push their bodies beyond the breaking point, ignoring the warning signs of exhaustion and illness. They worked through fevers, through injuries, and through the grief of losing friends, driven by the terrifying knowledge that in California, a man without gold was a man without a future, indistinguishable from the mud he stood in. As the months dragged on, the physical transformation of the men was shocking to behold. The fresh-faced youths who had left Boston and Philadelphia were replaced by gaunt, hollow-eyed specters. Their beards were matted with dirt, their clothes were reduced to tattered rags that offered no protection against the elements, and their hands were transformed into claw-like tools of bone and callus. They had become indigenous to the squalor they created, blending into the gray and brown palette of the camp until they were hardly recognizable as the individuals they once were. The light of the California dream had been extinguished in their eyes, replaced by the hard, flat stare of survivalists who knew that the only thing lying on the ground was gravel, and the only thing guaranteed in the mines was suffering. Ultimately, the great tragedy of 1849 was not just the physical hardship, but the profound isolation that accompanied it. Thousands of miles from home, with mail service unreliable or non-existent, these men suffered in a vacuum of emotional support. They died in the mud calling out names of wives and mothers who would not know of their passing for months, if ever. They were buried in shallow, unmarked graves on the hillsides, their resting places washed away by the next winter's rains, leaving no trace of their existence. The gold they sought was eternal, but they were disposable, fuel for a machine of commerce that cared nothing for the human cost of extraction. By the time the relentless snows of the first winter began to seal the mountain passes, cutting off the supply lines from the coast, the mining camps of the Sierra Nevada were descended upon by a second, silent plague that proved even more insidious than the violent purges of dysentery. This new affliction was not born of bacteria or filth, but of a profound dietary void, a nutritional bankruptcy caused by months of subsisting on a monotonous, gray regimen of salted pork, ancient flour, and coffee that contained no trace of life-sustaining vitality. Scurvy, the ancient scourge of long-distance mariners who spent months at sea, had found a new and unlikely home in the high-altitude wilderness of California, moving through the tents and cabins with a slow, creeping malice that dismantled the human body from the inside out. It did not strike with the sudden fever of an infection, but rather with a terrifying, gradual disintegration, transforming vigorous young men in the prime of their lives into decrepit, shuffling geriatrics within the span of a few agonizing weeks, their bodies betraying them in ways that defied all logic and medical understanding known to the common laborer. The initial onset of the disease was marked by a crushing, inexplicable lethargy that settled into the bones of the prospectors, a fatigue so profound that the mere act of lifting a pickaxe felt like hoisting a boulder. Men who had trekked thousands of miles across the Great Plains and wrestled wagons over the Rockies found themselves unable to rise from their bedrolls, their muscles turning to water and their spirits sinking into a deep, chemical melancholia. This was not simple laziness or exhaustion from work, it was the systemic failure of the body's ability to produce collagen, the very glue that holds the human form together. As the connective tissues began to break down, the skin took on a sallow, parchment-like quality, bruising at the slightest touch as the capillaries beneath the surface ruptured spontaneously, painting their limbs in mottled shades of purple, green, and black that looked like the markings of a corpse that had already begun to decompose. As the deficiency deepened, the horror manifested in the lower extremities with a specific cruelty that made the daily pilgrimage to the river a journey of torture. The legs of the afflicted miners would swell to twice their normal size, the skin stretching tight and shiny over the edema until it felt as though it might burst. This swelling was accompanied by a stiffening of the joints, particularly the knees and ankles, which locked into rigid angles as the tendons contracted and hardened, forcing men to hobble like cripples or crawl on their hands and knees through the freezing mud. The flesh of the calves and thighs would turn a terrifying shade of black, hard to the touch like wood, as if the life had simply evacuated the limbs while the heart was still beating. Every step sent shock waves of pain through the disintegrating body, a punishment for the simple desire to walk, leaving the camps filled with the sounds of groans and the shuffling of feet that could no longer be lifted from the earth. One of the most macabre and psychologically devastating symptoms of land scurvy was the spontaneous reopening of old wounds, a phenomenon that struck terror into the hearts of veterans and laborers alike. Scars that had been healed for decades, marks from childhood accidents, knife fights, or battles fought during the Mexican-American War, suddenly dissolved, the tissue unkidding itself as if time were running backward. A man might look down to see a cut on his arm from 10 years prior gaping open as fresh and raw as the day it was inflicted, bleeding freely into his shirt. Broken bones that had long since mended would separate again, leaving limbs flailing and useless, as the body cannibalized its own structural integrity in a desperate attempt to survive. This biological regression created a sense of inescapable horror, as the miners felt their personal histories literally opening up on their skin, their bodies unmaking themselves in a slow-motion dissolution that no bandage could arrest. However, the true epicenter of the nightmare lay within the mouth, where the disease executed its most visible and grotesque work, stripping the men of their ability to consume the very food they needed to survive. The gums, once firm and pink, underwent a hideous transformation, swelling into massive, sponge-like growths that engulfed the teeth and protruded from the lips in dark, necrotic masses. This tissue turned a deep, bruised violet or charcoal black, rotting while still attached to the jaw, and emitted a fetid, sickly sweet stench of decay that filled the tents and made the air unbreathable. The pain was excruciating, a constant throbbing ache that radiated through the skull, but the fragility of the tissue was even more alarming. The slightest pressure from a tongue or a spoon caused the gums to burst, filling the mouth with a mouthful of dark, coagulated blood that the miner was forced to swallow or spit out in endless streams. In the final stages of this oral degradation, the structural support for the teeth vanished entirely, turning the simple act of eating dinner into a scene of body horror. A prospector might sit down to a meal of beans and soaked hardtack, only to feel a strange, hard object loose in his mouth, spitting it out to discover a perfectly healthy, white molar lying in the tin plate. The teeth did not decay, they were simply ejected by the dying flesh, falling out one by one until the man was left with a raw, bloody cavern where his bite used to be. This rendered the consumption of the standard camp ration, tough jerky and rock-hard biscuits, physically impossible. Men starved to death not because they lacked food, but because the mechanical apparatus required to process it had been destroyed, leaving them to gaze hungrily at supplies they could not chew, their stomachs cramping with emptiness while their mouths rotted. The internal devastation was just as severe as the external ruin, as the lack of vitamin C caused hemorrhaging deep within the organs and the brain. Miners would suffer from sudden, catastrophic nosebleeds that could not be stanched, draining their vitality onto the canvas floors of their shelters. Others experienced bleeding into the lungs or the stomach, coughing up froth or passing blood, their bodies becoming sieves that could no longer contain their own fluids. This internal bleeding accelerated the descent into weakness, leading to fainting spells and a mental fog that clouded judgment and erased the will to fight. The brain, starved of nutrients and poisoned by the breakdown of the body, slipped into a delirium where the line between the nightmare of the camp and the hallucinations of the mind blurred, leaving men mumbling to themselves in the dark about feasts of oranges and fresh greens that existed only in their dying memories. Amidst this landscape of biological collapse, the cruel irony of the gold rush was brought into the sharpest and most tragic relief. Many of the men succumbing to the disease were not failures or paupers, they were successful prospectors whose leather pouches were heavy with the dust and nuggets they had pulled from the river. In the distorted economy of the starving camps, however, gold lost its universal value and was replaced by the desperate currency of nutrition. A single raw potato or a withered onion could command a price in gold dust equal to its weight, as dying men bid their entire fortunes for a mouthful of vegetable matter that might arrest the rot. Stories circulated of men trading nuggets the size of hens' eggs for a jar of pickles or a handful of dried apples, realizing too late that the yellow metal they had worshipped was edible only to the devil, and completely useless for knitting flesh back to bone. Those who could not find or afford these exorbitant cures died surrounded by their wealth, their treasures mocked by their mortality. It was not uncommon for a burial detail, tasked with disposing of the dead in the frozen ground, to find thousands of dollars in gold dust concealed in the belt or the boots of a corpse that weighed less than 90 pounds. The gold was often poured back into the ground with the body or looted by the survivors, a meaningless transfer of assets in a place where death was the only guaranteed payout. The strike that every man dreamed of had become a tomb, and the riches they had labored for were merely heavy stones that weighed down their pockets as they were lowered into shallow, muddy graves that would soon be forgotten by history. The psychological toll on the survivors was absolute, creating a pervasive atmosphere of doom that hung over the valleys like the winter fog. To watch a friend or a brother decompose while he was still breathing, to smell the gangrene of his mouth and see his old scars rip open, broke the spirit of even the most hardened frontiersman. The camps fell silent, the boisterous gambling and singing of the early days replaced by the quiet shuffling of the sick and the dull thud of shovels hitting the earth. Trust evaporated, as men hoarded any scrap of fresh food with paranoid intensity, guarding a turnip with the same ferocity they once guarded their claims. The social contract of the mining community dissolved, replaced by a primal struggle for biological integrity, where the envy was directed not at the men with the biggest nugget, but at the men who still had his teeth. By the time the spring thaw finally arrived to open the passes and bring fresh supplies from the coast, the demographic of the camps had been irrevocably altered. The Argonauts, who had arrived as symbols of youthful vigor, were now a population of broken survivors, missing teeth, walking with limps, and carrying the psychological scars of a winter spent in hell. The graves that dotted the hillsides were filled not with the victims of accidents or violence, but with the victims of a dream that failed to account for the fragility of the human machine. The gold was still there, waiting in the gravel, but the illusion of glory had been washed away, leaving behind the stark realization that in the calculus of the wilderness, a lemon was worth more than a mountain of ore. However, for the fortunate few who managed to survive the bacterial ravages of the bloody flux and avoided the skeletal disintegration of scurvy, a far more insidious and elemental enemy lay in wait, one that did not emerge from the filth of the latrines or the lack of fruit, but was carried by the men themselves in heavy, iron-stoppered flasks tucked into their saddlebags. This threat was not a disease in the biological sense, but a chemical agent of destruction that the miners embraced as their greatest ally in the quest for wealth, ignorant of the fact that they were handling one of the most potent neurotoxins known to science. To capture the elusive, microscopic dust of gold that permeated the river silt, the prospectors turned to mercury, a heavy, liquid metal they reverently referred to as quicksilver, which possessed the alchemical ability to devour gold upon contact and trap it within its silvery embrace. The necessity of using mercury arose from the geological reality of the California placers, where much of the gold was not found in the form of satisfying, heavy nuggets that could be easily plucked from the stream bed, but rather as flour gold, a dust so fine it floated on water and vanished with the current. To lose this dust was to lose half the profit of a claim, so the miners relied on the process of amalgamation, a chemical marriage where the mercury acted as a magnet, dissolving the gold into a gray, putty-like paste while rejecting the sand and rock. This magical property made quicksilver as valuable as the gold itself, a substance that was traded, hoarded, and handled with a casual familiarity that belied its lethal nature, treated by the uneducated laborers as if it were nothing more than a heavy, metallic grease. In the frantic, muddy race to process tons of gravel each day, the concept of industrial safety was non-existent, and the men engaged with the toxic metal using the only tools they had available, their own bodies. They would pour pounds of the shimmering, restless liquid directly into their wooden sluice boxes and gold pans, plunging their bare hands into the freezing slurry to mix the mercury with the dirt, breaking up clumps of clay to ensure every particle of gold was contacted. They worked the mixture like bakers kneading dough, coating their fingers, palms, and forearms in a silvery sheen that refused to wash off, grinding the neurotoxin deep into the cracks of their calloused skin and under their fingernails, where it remained for days. The exposure was not limited to the hands. In larger operations utilizing the long tom rocker boxes, the volume of earth to be processed was so great that manual mixing was deemed inefficient. Here, the miners would pour jugs of mercury into the bottom of the troughs and then climb inside barefoot, tramping back and forth for hours to churn the gravel and quicksilver together with the weight of their bodies. They marched in a toxic soup, the mercury absorbing into the soles of their feet and the pores of their legs, entering the bloodstream through the largest organ of the body with terrifying efficiency. They laughed at the sensation of the heavy, cold liquid squishing between their toes, unaware that with every step, they were pumping a cumulative poison directly into their central nervous system. This dermal absorption was a slow, silent invasion, a chemical siege that bypassed the body's natural defenses, but the true catastrophe occurred when the sun went down, and the physical work of the river gave way to the chemical work of the camp. The result of the day's labor was not pure gold, but amalgam, a dull, gray lump that looked like a ball of lead or wet cement, consisting of gold dissolved in mercury. To realize their profits, the miners had to separate the two metals, a process that required heat to boil off the mercury, leaving the gold sponge behind. In the correct industrial setting, this would be done in a sealed iron retort that captured the vapors, but in the primitive squalor of the gold fields, such equipment was a luxury few could afford or bothered to transport over the mountains. Instead, the separation process became a nightly domestic ritual performed in the most dangerous environment possible, the frying pan, the shovel blade, or a simple iron pot placed directly over an open fire. Because the nights in the Sierra Nevada were bone-chillingly cold and the camps were often plagued by wind or rain, the miners inevitably brought this operation indoors, seeking the shelter of their canvas tents or small, chinked log cabins. They would seal the flaps tight to conserve warmth, creating an airtight chamber of death, and place the ball of amalgam on the heat source, crouching over it to watch the transformation with the eagerness of men about to be paid. As the temperature of the gray mass rose, the mercury, which has a boiling point far lower than that of gold, began to undergo a phase change, transforming from a heavy liquid into an invisible, colorless vapor. This gas rose from the pan in thick, silent plumes, filling the small, unventilated space of the tent with a concentration of heavy metal toxicity that would be considered a hazmat emergency in the modern world. The air inside the shelter, already stale with the smell of sweat and tobacco, became saturated with mercury vapor, a ghost that could not be seen but whose presence was absolute and lethal. The miners, huddled around the fire for warmth and greed, breathed in deep, rhythmic drafts of this poison, pulling the heavy metal directly into the delicate alveoli of their lungs. From the lungs, the mercury vapor bypassed the body's filtration systems and entered the oxygenated blood, which carried it swiftly to the brain, the organ for which mercury has a terrifyingly specific affinity. Unlike other poisons that might destroy the liver or the kidneys first, mercury vapor crosses the blood-brain barrier with ease, lodging itself in the neurons and beginning a process of cellular destruction that targets the centers of memory, emotion, and motor control. The miners were not just inhaling smoke, they were inhaling a solvent that dissolved the very architecture of their personalities, a neurotoxin that attacked the mind before it killed the body. The sensory experience of this poisoning was deceptively mild, often described by survivors as having a faintly sweet or metallic taste in the back of the throat, a flavor that was easily masked by the harshness of cheap whiskey or coffee. There was no immediate choking, no coughing fit to warn them of the danger, only a slight dizziness or a feeling of intoxication that they attributed to the heat of the fire or the exhaustion of the day. This lack of immediate feedback encouraged the practice, as the men saw the mercury boil away and the bright, yellow luster of pure gold emerge in the pan, a visual reward that reinforced the behavior night after night. They believed they were purifying the gold, but in reality, they were distilling their own madness, trading their sanity for a pile of metal that sat shining in the firelight. The intimacy of this poisoning was horrific. These men cooked their food in the same pans they used to boil mercury, ate with hands coated in amalgam residue, and slept in bedding that had absorbed the condensed vapor of 100 nights of retorting. The canvas walls of their tents became impregnated with the toxin, releasing it back into the air every time the fabric was disturbed or heated by the morning sun, ensuring that the exposure was continuous and unrelenting. The entire camp environment became a toxic zone, where the soil around the fire pits glittered with microscopic beads of spilled mercury, and the air hung heavy with the exhaust of the refinement process. Even the wildlife in the immediate vicinity of the camps began to succumb to the invisible plague, with camp dogs suffering from fits and tremors, and birds falling dead from the trees around the cooking fires. Yet, the miners, blinded by the gold fever, failed to connect the dots, attributing their own headaches and trembling hands to the hard labor and the harsh climate. They viewed the mercury as a tool, a servant to their ambition, never suspecting that the servant was slowly murdering the master in his sleep. They were conquering the geology of the earth while simultaneously destroying the biology of their own brains, engaging in a nightly suicide pact that they mistook for industry. The scene inside these tents at night was a tableau of Gothic horror, faces illuminated by the blue flame of burning mercury, eyes wide with the reflection of gold, while the invisible angel of death filled the lungs of every man present. They would celebrate their haul, weighing the gold dust in their hands, laughing and planning their futures, while the neural pathways required to enjoy that future were being systematically severed. The heavy metal settled in their cerebellums, waiting like a time bomb, ensuring that even if they left the mountains with their fortunes intact, they would never truly leave the poison behind. It was a tragedy of ignorance, where the quest for the ultimate element led men to embrace the one substance that could steal their souls, leaving them rich in gold but bankrupt in mind. By the time the fire died down and the gold was tucked safely into leather pouches, the damage was irreversible. The mercury had bonded to the fat of the brain, starting a clock that ticked down toward total neurological collapse. The miners would crawl into their bedrolls, coughing slightly, perhaps feeling a strange tightness in the chest or a ringing in the ears, but dismissing it as the price of doing business. They drifted off to sleep in the poisonous fog they had created, dreaming of mansions and fine carriages, unaware that they were already prisoners of the quicksilver, condemned to a madness that would strip them of everything long before the gold ran out. The physiological consequences of this nightly inhalation of neurotoxic vapors did not manifest with the immediacy of a gunshot wound or the sudden onset of a fever, but rather crept upon the camps with a slow, relentless inevitability that made the horror all the more irreversible. The mercury accumulated in the fatty tissues of the brain over weeks and months, crossing the blood-brain barrier to wage a silent war against the very architecture of the human mind, dismantling the personality one neuron at a time. At first, the symptoms were dismissed as the natural byproduct of exhaustion, the physical toll of moving tons of wet gravel under a punishing sun, or the result of drinking too much cheap whiskey to ward off the mountain chill. However, as the concentrations of the metal reached critical mass within the central nervous system, the camps began to transform from communities of hopeful laborers into open-air asylums populated by men who were losing their grip on reality. The first visible sign of the catastrophe was a distinctive and uncontrollable tremor of the extremities, a motor dysfunction that became so common in the diggings that it earned its own grim nomenclature among the medical men of the West. It was the same affliction that plagued the felt makers of the hatting industry, known as the hatter's shakes, but here it struck down burly frontiersmen who had once prided themselves on their steady hands and physical prowess. A miner would reach for his coffee cup in the morning and find that his hand vibrated with a rhythmic, coarse shudder that he could not suppress by force of will, spilling the hot liquid over his own legs. This loss of fine motor control was devastating for men whose livelihood depended on the delicate task of separating gold dust from sand, leading to a clumsy ineptitude that saw valuable pans of sediment dropped back into the river, the gold lost forever due to the twitching of poisoned nerves. Following the physical tremors came a profound and disturbing shift in the psychological landscape of the miner, marked by the onset of a condition known medically as erethism, but referred to in the camp simply as the madness. The boisterous, rowdy camaraderie that had defined the early days of the gold rush, where strangers shared fires and stories with open hearts, evaporated into a thick, suffocating atmosphere of pathological shyness and timidity. Men who had fearlessly crossed the Great Plains and fought off grizzly bears suddenly found themselves terrified of human interaction, shrinking away from conversation as if the mere sound of another voice caused them physical pain. They would retreat into their tents when someone approached, hiding in the shadows like frightened children, their eyes wide with an inexplicable dread, unable to articulate why the presence of their fellow men had become a source of unbearable anxiety. This unnatural withdrawal was quickly succeeded by the blooming of a dark and aggressive paranoia, a chemical delusion that rewrote the social contract of the mining districts and turned every neighbor into a potential enemy. The mercury eroded the brain's ability to process trust and logic, replacing rational thought with a conspiracy-laden worldview where every glance was a threat and every whisper was a plot. A miner sitting alone by his fire would become convinced that the men in the next tent were not sleeping, but were watching him through the canvas, plotting to slit his throat and steal the gold he had buried beneath his bedroll. He would stay awake for nights on end, clutching a loaded pistol, his eyes darting back and forth in the darkness, guarding his claim against phantoms that existed only in the decaying synapses of his own poisoned mind. The most tragic casualty of this chemical warfare was the dissolution of the partner relationship, the sacred bond between mining partners that was the fundamental unit of survival on the frontier. Men who had grown up together in the same eastern villages, who had saved each other's lives on the trail and shared their last crust of bread, suddenly turned on one another with a vicious, irrational hatred. The paranoia whispered that the partner was skimming gold from the sluice box, hiding the biggest nuggets in his boot, or secretly communicating with claim jumpers. Accusations of theft became rampant, hurled not based on evidence, but on the hallucinations of a mercury-soaked brain, destroying lifelong friendships in seconds and replacing them with a simmering, murderous resentment that turned the shared tent into a combat zone. As the neurotoxin continued to dissolve the centers of emotional regulation, the camps became plagued by auditory and visual hallucinations that blurred the line between the wilderness and the nightmare. The wind howling through the pines ceased to be a weather phenomenon and transformed into a chorus of voices, mocking the miners, whispering their names, or screaming warnings about impending doom. Men would be seen standing waist-deep in the freezing river, shouting arguments at the empty air, swinging their picks at shadows they believed were demons or bandits sent to destroy them. The bubbling of the stream sounded like the footsteps of intruders, and the flickering light of the campfire cast shadows that detached themselves from the ground and moved with malicious intent, driving the observers to the brink of total psychological collapse. The ultimate manifestation of this neurological decay was the explosion of senseless, unprovoked violence that turned the gold fields into a slaughterhouse where the motive was often incomprehensible. The Mercury destroyed the impulse control mechanisms of the frontal lobe, meaning that a minor irritation, a spilled pot of beans, a look perceived as disrespectful, or a dispute over a few inches of dirt, triggered a rage response of homicidal intensity. Brawls broke out not for honor or property, but because the chemical fire in the brain demanded a release, leading to knife fights where men slashed each other to ribbons over trivialities. These were not the calculated duels of the frontier code, they were frenzy attacks by men who had lost the ability to distinguish between a friend and a threat, striking out with the blind fury of rabid animals. In the final stages of the poisoning, when the mind could no longer reconcile the terrifying hallucinations with reality, many of the 49ers sought the only escape that seemed logical to their fractured consciousness. The suicide rate in the camp skyrocketed, with men putting pistols to their heads or hanging themselves from the sturdy oaks, not because they had failed to find gold, but because they could no longer endure the noise in their heads. Others simply walked away, abandoning claims that were producing rich yields of gold, wandering into the deep woods in a fugue state, driven by voices that told them to flee the poison of the camp. They left behind jars of gold dust, tools, and unread letters from home, disappearing into the wilderness to die of exposure, their bodies eventually found miles away, clutching nothing but the thin air. The tragedy of the mercury poisoning was that it targeted the very attribute required to succeed in the West, the rugged, indomitable will of the individual. It hollowed out the men from the inside, leaving the shell of a prospector while destroying the human being within, turning the dream of independence into a prison of dependency and fear. The camps, which were supposed to be the founderies of a new American destiny, became open-air asylums where the inmates were armed, wealthy, and completely insane. The gold they extracted was heavy and pure, but the hands that held it shook with a palsy that no doctor could cure, and the eyes that looked upon it saw not wealth, but a terrifying, distorted world where the rocks screamed and the water burned. By the time the winter rains came to wash away the filth of the camps, thousands of men had been reduced to chemical casualties, their potential wasted not by the hardship of the land, but by the silver liquid they had trusted to make them rich. They rotted in the mud, their brains riddled with lesions, while the mercury they had released into the environment began its long, slow journey down the watershed, poisoning the rivers for generations to come. The gold rush had promised a life of freedom and abundance, but for the victims of the quicksilver, it delivered only a solitary, trembling descent into a hell of their own making, where the final sensation was not the triumph of discovery, but the terrifying isolation of a mind burning down to ash. In the early spring of the year 1851, when the sun finally began to reclaim the high country from the iron grip of winter, the melting snows of the Sierra Nevada revealed the tragic debris of the human spirit that had been buried for months under white drifts. A team of government surveyors, tasked with mapping the chaotic topography of the mining districts, found themselves navigating a remote and precipitous gorge along a tributary of the American River, a place so jagged and shadowed that the maps marked it simply as impassable terrain. As they hacked their way through the thawing brush and climbed over granite boulders slick with runoff, they stumbled upon a solitary, weathered structure that seemed to grow out of the canyon wall itself, a rough-hewn log cabin that stood in profound, unnatural silence against the roar of the spring floodwaters. The structure bore no signs of life, there was no smoke rising from the stone chimney to signal warmth, no fresh tracks in the mud around the door, and the heavy silence that hung over the clearing suggested a tomb rather than a dwelling, prompting the men to approach with a caution born of the grim realities of the frontier. Upon forcing open the heavy wooden door, which had been swollen shut by the dampness of the season, the surveyors were met with a blast of stale, frigid air that smelled of ancient dust and something sharper, metallic and chemical, that stung the back of their throats. Inside, illuminated by the shafts of sunlight piercing through the gaps in the chinking, they discovered a tableau of death that was as peaceful as it was horrifying, frozen in time like a museum exhibit of the gold rush's ultimate cost. Seated at a rough plank table in the center of the room was the rigid, motionless figure of a man, his head resting heavily on his crossed arms as if he had simply fallen asleep while contemplating his work. This was the same young prospector who had been visited by the physician months earlier, the man whose trembling hands could not hold a cup of water, now finally still, released from his tremors by the finality of death, sitting in eternal vigil over the fruits of his lethal labor. Directly in front of the corpse, rising from the center of the table like a pagan idol, was a magnificent, terrifyingly perfect pyramid of gold dust and nuggets, a hoard that caught the light and shimmered with a brilliance that illuminated the gloom of the shack. The surveyors, men who had seen the meager scrapings of average claims, stood transfixed by the sheer volume of the treasure. It was estimated to weigh nearly 50 pounds, a fortune of such staggering magnitude that it could have purchased a sprawling estate in New York, a seat in the Senate, or a life of leisure for 3 generations of his descendants. This was the motherlode, the mythical strike that every 49er dreamed of as they froze in the rivers, sitting there in plain sight, purified and consolidated into a monument of immense wealth. Yet, the men who had wrenched this fortune from the earth had not spent a single ounce of it, dying in squalor with a king's ransom within reach of his cold, stiff fingers. To the right of the gold pile lay a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen with moisture, offering a harrowing forensic accounting of the man's descent into the chemical abyss that had claimed him. The early entries were written in a clear, firm hand, detailing the coordinates of his claim, the daily yield of the sluice boxes, and the ecstatic calculations of his growing net worth, painting a portrait of a rational, ambitious young man with a bright future. However, as the dates progressed into the deep winter, the handwriting began to deteriorate, transforming from elegant script into jagged, erratic scrawls that betrayed the onset of the severe tremors that had racked his nervous system. The narrative coherence fractured alongside his motor control, with entries becoming repetitive and paranoid, obsessing over phantom thieves he believed were tunneling under his floorboards and voices that whispered to him from the fireplace, signaling the Mercury's triumphant conquest of his frontal lobe. The final pages of the diary were the most disturbing evidence of his complete psychological disintegration, as language itself had failed him in his final days, replaced by a chaotic landscape of madness transferred onto paper. The writing ceased entirely, giving way to page after page of crude, frantic drawings depicting disembodied eyes and screaming mouths, sketched with a heavy, dark charcoal that had been pressed so hard it tore through the paper. These were not the doodles of a bored mind, but the desperate reportage of a hallucinating brain, documenting the demons that the mercury vapors had summoned to torment him in his isolation. The sketches revealed a man who was being watched by the walls, a prisoner in a claustrophobic nightmare where the inanimate objects of his cabin had come alive to mock his suffering, proving that long before his heart stopped beating, the person he had been was already dead, erased by the neurotoxin. But it was the condition of the corpse itself that provided the most chilling testament to the cause of his demise, a biological anomaly that made even the hardened surveyors recoil in superstitious dread. The man had been dead for months, likely succumbing to the cold and starvation in the depths of January, yet his body showed almost no signs of the natural decomposition that should have reduced him to a skeleton. His skin was gray and leathery, preserved in a state of uncanny mummification, not by the cold alone, but by the massive concentrations of mercury that had saturated every cell of his being. He had inhaled and absorbed so much of the toxic metal during his nightly refining sessions that his tissues had become fundamentally hostile to the bacteria and insects that drive the process of decay, turning him into a statue of poisoned flesh that time could not touch. The isolation of the cabin meant that the local scavengers, the coyotes, mountain lions, and vultures that act as the wilderness's cleanup crew, had ample access to the body through the unlatched window or the gaps in the roof. Yet, the dust on the floor around the chair was marked by the prints of wolves and rodents that had approached the corpse, circled it, and then turned away without taking a single bite. The instincts of the wild animals, honed by thousands of years of survival, had warned them that this meat was tainted, that the thing sitting at the table was not food, but a vessel of death. The mercury that had killed him protected him in death, creating a chemical force field that repulsed even the starving predators of the winter, leaving him to sit undisturbed in his toxic vigil. This rejection by the natural world served as the final, grim punctuation mark on his journey, isolating him even in death from the cycle of life that defined the wilderness he had tried to conquer. He had become a synthetic object, a man made of heavy metal, as distinct and separate from the forest as the gold he worshipped. The surveyors realized with a shudder that if they were to bury him, the soil itself would likely be poisoned by his presence, that he was a piece of hazardous waste that the earth was reluctant to accept. He was a monument to the unnatural act of his own destruction, a being who had transubstantiated his own biology into the very elements he mined, achieving a perverse kind of immortality that no one would ever want. The irony of the scene was a crushing weight in the small room, a physical manifestation of the futility that lay at the heart of the gold rush fever. Here sat a man who had won the great game, who had achieved the statistical miracle of finding the fortune that tens of thousands of others had died seeking, and yet his victory was indistinguishable from the ultimate defeat. The gold on the table was useless to him, a pile of yellow metal that could not buy him warmth, sanity, or a single moment of peace in his final hours. He had traded the priceless commodity of his mind for a commodity of trade that had no value in the room where he died, dying a pauper's death in the presence of a king's treasury. As the surveyors packed up the gold, cataloging it for the state treasury, and prepared to bury the body in a deep grave marked only by a pile of stones, they felt like grave robbers disturbing a pharaoh's tomb. They understood that the true story of the California dream was not written in the headlines of the Eastern papers, but in the silence of this canyon, where a man had slowly boiled his own brain in pursuit of a rock. The cabin was left to rot, eventually reclaiming the space by the forest, but the legend of the Mercury man lingered, a ghost story whispered in the camps about the price of greed. The gold he found would eventually be melted down and minted into coins that circulated through the economy of a growing nation, carrying no trace of the madness and poison that had birthed them, leaving only the wind in the gorge to mourn the men who sat alone, the eternal, toxic guardian of a treasure that killed him.